Hi, I'm Professor John Romano, and I'm recording this lecture for my course, Byzantine History. This lecture is on the age of Justinian, who, as I think you'll see in the course of this lecture, is normally considered to be one of the most important Byzantine emperors. When we last spoke about imperial succession, we had said that Anastasios had died, which ends up causing considerable confusion about who was supposed to take his place afterwards. The imperial bodyguard surrounding the emperor ended up deciding that it was going to proclaim one of its own officers as the next emperor. This is here a coin from him, Justin I. Justin I, though, ended up dying relatively soon, but before he did so, he ended up adopting his own nephew, the man we know as Justinian. This is one of the most famous images of Justinian, this beautifully carved ivory with him as a man of war in the center. We think now that at least some people suspect that Justinian may have actually been something of a shadow emperor while Justin I was still around. There was no doubt once he comes to power over just how he manages to assume this position to really turn the position of Byzantine emperor into something quite interesting. Justinian really was well placed to take over the position of emperor. He had a very good education. He had remarkable reserves of energy. He loved wealth. He loved projecting strength. Perhaps even at this point, he recognizes the raw possibilities available for the empire. Now, bear in mind, some of the things he did, though, end up making him quite controversial. Contemporaries were never entirely sure what to make of him. Is this a question of a man who's just very ambitious, or was he someone who was overreaching? Was he someone committed to innovation, or in some ways was he just a very traditional Roman? No one could seem to agree. Even his closest biographer seemed to have trouble making heads or tails of him. One of the reasons we care so much about Justinian is that there is a very good foundation of sources preserved for his reign. Procopius really provides a military narrative of his reign. Procopius also wrote an account of the buildings that Justinian had erected. And he writes, in addition, what is known as his secret history, which ends up really preserving the absolute most negative possible valuation of Justinian's reign. And we're lucky here in that Procopius was not only a contemporary of Justinian, but someone who knew him, who participated in many of these events, was an eyewitness, for instance, to some of the wars he described. So really someone who is uniquely placed to discuss what Justinian's reign was like. Justinian ends up marrying Theodora, who seems to have been an actress. Some of the rumors circulating around her would say that she was much worse previous than an actress, but it's possible that some of the more scandalous details of her background were just formulated by her enemies. In any case, Justinian plunged ahead and married her, even though actresses, really, generally speaking, did not have a high reputation in the Byzantine world. Immediately upon coming into power, we do think that Justinian institutes a major reform regarding the troops who defended the eastern frontier. And in effect, he really reorganizes the way the Byzantine military is deployed on the Persian front. putting in a new command for the border troops and a much more mobile army as well. And we do think that this ends up really having dividends. The Byzantines achieved their first victories over the Persians for many years, and were even, in fact, able to turn back a Persian invasion. And it's actually an interesting point. Probably the first ever perpetual peace treaty in history was signed with the Persians at this point, which the hope being, of course, that the Byzantines had a lot of problems, and by resolving their eastern front, the emperor then could turn his attention elsewhere. In the north, too, on the northern border, the Byzantines would win some victories over barbarians as well. Altogether, he's able to make modest increases in the number of troops on the eastern and northern fronts. Justinian's reign is always associated with this really profound interest in law, which had been something, of course, that Romans had long cared about. Romans always fashioned themselves as a people of law and order. And we do see now Justinian institutes legal reforms of absolutely unprecedented scope. He has some of his lawyers, his jurists, do all sorts of research, which was done very quickly and in some cases very sloppily. But this legal commission then ends up publishing a new collection of laws, sometimes known as the Justinian Code. And this code ends up being more ambitious than the Theodosian Code. And in fact, some of its laws went back even further than the Emperor Constantine. The purpose of this legal code was, in fact, to eliminate all and really supersede all previous laws. This was, in some ways, the first truly comprehensive Roman legal code to be produced. And I'm showing you some of these manuscripts that preserve some of these laws from Western Europe, because in later times, Western European lawyers would look to the Code of Justinian as the basis for the legal systems of European law. So it becomes enormously influential altogether. In addition to just producing a series of laws, authoritative laws, this same commission will also create the Digest, which was a codification of legal commentaries, so things that legal scholars had written on the law to help explain it. And in addition, create a new textbook for law known as the Institutes. These three new legal productions sometimes are seen collectively as the body of civil law. In addition to just codifying old law or bringing it together, we also see that Justinian supplements these older laws by issuing new laws in his own name. And some of these laws are things that are simply repeated things that have been done previously. For instance, laws against pagans, in some cases even newer laws against pagans, laws against heretics. Interestingly enough, not laws against monophysites. We really do think that Justinian seems to have viewed it as his duty as a Christian emperor to make sure that, in effect, these what he viewed as deviant belief was stamped out. Some of the laws of Justinian were especially harsh against Manichaeans. There were still Manichaeans circulating in the Roman world at this time. And we see now that much more so than previous emperors, Justinian begins to remove pagans from governmental positions. And in fact, it begins to aim really at the heart of old pagan philosophy. Again, we'd already seen violent actions taken against certain philosophers, but Justinian goes ahead and finally closes the academy that Plato had opened in the ancient world. This is normally seen as one of the great setbacks for philosophy in the medieval period. Justinian, like others before, continually attempts to find some sort of theological formula that will satisfy both those on the Orthodox side and the Monophysites. But he discovered, as others previously had discovered, that it was virtually impossible to satisfy both sides of this theological debate, no matter how many councils he convened. And part of Justinian's problem is that his wife, Theodora, was actually a Monophysite herself. So harbor beliefs that were unacceptable to the Orthodox majority. And we know that Theodore actually, within imperial grounds, will harbor monks and clergy from the Monophysite side. So there's only so much that Justinian could do to work against them. This situation, though, created the appearance, scandalous to some, that in some cities you see a double hierarchy of both Orthodox and Monophysite bishops and other priests. Among other things that Justinian worked against, was corruption in government. He saw in the past that certain positions in government were sold because you could make money on them, which he stopped. He also eliminates offices that he views to be useless. And we don't think Justinian's family actually comes from very high or illustrious roots. This may actually have made him sensitive to choosing in government often men who came from a fairly modest background altogether. He didn't really care that some of these people working for him were not storied Roman families. In spite of all of this, we do see that Justinian, toward the beginning of his reign, encounters some significant problems in keeping rebellions from starting up. And in particular, two of the circus factions begin to raise problems. The circus, of course, this is the hippodrome here. This is where horse racing took place. You can see today preserved in a park in modern-day Istanbul, where the hippodrome was. This is an emperor starting one of the races in the hippodrome. The circus factions had started as groups who would support various teams of horses in the hippodrome races, but in fact they also become these groups that in some cases will take part in political action as well. Under Justinian, two of these circus factions begin to demand pardon for unforgivable acts, including murder. They begin to demand that some of Justinian's officials who had worked against them would be ousted. In fact, at the time they become radicalized enough to begin to demand that there simply be a new emperor on the throne. We see, in effect, that Justinian initially, when these riots basically begin to break out among the factions, that he actually, for a period of time, actually considers taking refuge away from the city to let it die down. And it really seems in this case that it was Theodora, his wife, who had enough mettle to say that she herself would never flee, and in fact it appears to have actually shamed Justinian to staying put and making a stand against these rioters. In effect, these rioters were suppressed in the bloodiest way possible, basically sending the army in. These riots would later become known as the Nika riots. Nika means victory. This was the normal cheer done in the course of horse racing. Here, though, of course, used in a very different context. Ultimately speaking, once the army was sent in, one of the rebel leaders was publicly executed, and the property of anyone who had supported this faction was then confiscated. Here's again, is this Justinian carved out of porphyry? We think that Justinian always had in the back of his head, as many Byzantines did, that any of the territory in Western Europe or elsewhere that had slipped out of the hands of the Roman Empire still belonged to them. And we do think that he very clearly wanted some kind of reconquest. And really, in essence, to restore the empire to its appropriate boundaries, and really also undergirded supposedly by a religious mission. One of the benefits of doing this was that upon reconquering this territory, they could champion Christian orthodoxy in areas that had been overrun supposedly by Arian heretics. Which, again, in effect, of course, because many of the barbarians were Arians. And in effect, Justinian is never shy about declaring, in effect, that he felt that God favored his plans, and one of the reasons he would go ahead and attempt this reconquest. One of the other reasons he likely decided that a reconquest was the best path was that he wanted to turn people's attention away from the bloody end of the Nika riots, which must have left a bad taste in some people's mouths. This is likely a portrait of the main general that Justinian had, known as Belisarius. Belisarius had already gained significant experience on the eastern border fighting against Persia, and then Justinian decides to give him a very different and perhaps even more difficult task. Belisarius would sail off to fight in Roman Africa, approximately modern-day Tunisia, with approximately 18,000 soldiers. This plan likely was viewed as risky by some, but likely the justification was that Belisarius went off with a small enough army that even if they failed completely, it would not entirely ruin the state. So they decided to give it the green light. From everything we can see about the description of his actions in battle, Belisarius appears to have been a talented commander, very good at rousing morale, inspiring his army. And to give you some idea what we're talking about here, this is a full map. You can see that that's kind of darker purple is the territory that Justinian ends up reconquering, starting with here in Africa, then in Italy and Sicily, here in Spain. One of the reasons that this task, which appeared monumental, did have a good reason, a good reason that it might be successful, is that the Vandals, who were in charge of Africa, had really managed to alienate the vast majority of the Roman population. They stripped them of a good deal of their property. They also had attacked those who were Orthodox and persecuted them. And it also appears that at this point, most of the Vandals really had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The landing by Belisarius was a complete surprise. Many of the Vandal armies were not there at all. Some of those that were there really were entirely unable to resist. We also see that Belisarius was greeted by many of the native Romans in the region. And really, without too much trouble then, Belisarius had managed to reincorporate the province of Africa into the empire. And Belisarius then was able to celebrate a good old-fashioned Roman victory procession, a triumph. And everyone knew, of course, this was more than just a symbolic victory. This region, Africa, was particularly important because of its agricultural production. At one point, in fact, it had been like the breadbasket of the empire. It produced a lot of grain, produced a lot of olive oil. None of this is to say that the region was entirely stable even after Belisarius' reconquest. Native Moors, for instance, still carried out raids against it. But we do think, on the whole, this was a fast and easy war. And in fact, the speed of the war really helped to spare much desolation. The territory was largely whole. It was at this point, perhaps becoming even more ambitious after the initial successes, that Justinian saw the chance for a much greater reconquest, which was Italy, which again, it really had been at the heart of the old Roman Empire. In addition to that symbolic value, we do think, of course, Italy is an enormously powerful, rich area. And we do think that people were not under any illusions, though, that this would take much more fighting to be able to take against some of the barbarian groups that had settled in the region. Initially speaking, we think that Belisarius had even attempted to make some secret deals with certain barbarians in Italy, which ended up being a complete failure, and then he decides that the only hope is to actually invade. Initially attacking Sicily with only probably around 7,500 men. In spite of the fact that there was not a large invading force, Belisarius was able to seize Sicily. And Sicily in and of itself is really a prize agriculturally, but we also think that Sicily then could serve as a base for a broader Italian invasion to go onto the mainland. When Belisarius did exactly that, traveled to Italy, he ends up fighting an indecisive battle against the barbarian group that was dominant in Italy at the time, the so-called Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths. And it was at this point that he had to abandon Italy for a period of time. He had to immediately go back to Africa against some of his own troops who were rebelling because they had not been paid. And only then could he switch his attention back to Italy. We do see that when Belisarius returns to Italy, he's initially able to take important cities. He took Naples, Rome, the walls of which are pictured here, turned over to him without a fight initially. However, Belisarius himself soon gets besieged in the city of Rome because he has too few men and there are too many people opposing him. He manages then to break out. He rallies his forces. He gains some military reinforcements, and he starts marching further to the north in Italy. We think that finally, after a lot of heavy fighting, Belisarius manages to get the Ostrogoths to surrender, but part of the reason they chose to surrender is that the Ostrogoths had been deceived into thinking Belisarius would become the head of a kind of revived Western Empire. One of the problems with all of this war in the West was that the Byzantines had really taken their attention off the eastern border. And in fact, Justinian actually had had taken off soldiers specifically from the eastern border, perhaps hoping that the treaty with the Persians, this perpetual peace treaty, would allow him then to ignore the border entirely. And this, of course, proved to be a really problematic assumption. Really, the Persians decide to use this opportunity where they see that the borders are not properly being watched to turn around and to begin attacking some of the cities in the eastern part of the empire, especially in modern-day Syria, both to gain glory and to gain money. The worst part about all this is when the Persian army descends upon Antioch, which really had been one of the great cities of the East. I'm showing here some of the images, some of the few things that remain from Antioch in this period. Here's again a sketch, a modern sketch of some of these areas. Here's some of the mosaics from the city of Antioch. It really was a fantastically rich city at its height. Most of the city of Antioch after this Persian invasion was burnt down. In addition to that, the Persians took thousands of citizens as captive. And it really turned around then immediately and tried to extort a large amount of money to recover the hostages and to sue for peace. When Belisarius, then the man got absolutely no rest, apparently. When he returned to the Eastern Front, he decides then to take his army. He leads a campaign of revenge, just attacking Persian cities to make up for the destruction that they had caused. Belisarius chooses not to take the capital city of Ctesiphon, in part because he has no faith in his own army. But also, on top of that, his own wife, shown here, seems to actually have been involved with a plot with Justinian's wife, Theodora, in which they were essentially removing officials they didn't like and causing chaos in the state. When Belisarius returned, far from getting a hero's welcome, he really essentially had to tolerate his wife's behavior, even though to some it was scandalous, including his wife Antonina actually has an affair with his adopted son. Belisarius really cuts a very strange figure in all of this. We do think his prestige in the Roman world, the Byzantine world, is extremely high during this period, but because he had managed to accomplish so much on the battlefield, really many people seem to suspect that he might possibly be guilty of disloyalty. If he had really wanted to, Belisarius easily could have tried to become an emperor on his own. So it does appear that Justinian and Theodora were afraid of Belisarius, although one should point out that in reality it appears that he was nothing but loyal. Belisarius also really more than once attempts to retire, and he even has some accusations of corruption thrown in his direction that end up being dismissed, but show that he's having trouble establishing himself after all this fighting. Justinian, to respond to these kind of attacks by the Persians, begins to use money to rebuild some eastern cities. It begins to pour money back into them, but it's one thing to rebuild. It's another thing to create entirely new monuments in your own name. And the most important of these by far is the Church of the Hagia Sophia, name that means in Greek holy wisdom. And it should give you some idea of the kind of respect that people had for wisdom, wisdom's sanctity, just like in the biblical book of wisdom. This is what the Hagia Sophia looks like today. Naturally, when it was first erected, it did not have these Muslim minarets that were put on much later on. Hagia Sophia is a vast church in its size. Its dome is both high and enormous. And really, it serves as the focal church in the Byzantine Empire, located, of course, in the city of Constantinople for its entire history. And really, you can see from some of these images just how much gold mosaic is involved with building it, and the way that the apse really faces toward the east, so that especially in the morning when the liturgy would be celebrated, light would have just poured into the central part of the church. And we see just the way that the dome is, these dome really is created. Chant could float up there and essentially circulate and continue to resonate even after the chanters had stopped singing. Here's one of the many mosaics dedicated to the Mother of God, to Mary, that goes up in the Hagia Sophia. Again, this is a modern image, again with the Muslim images that, of course, would not have been there originally. We also see that Justinian begins to build other things, some new fortifications for certain parts of the empire, new churches, including here pictured the monastery dedicated to St. Catherine on Mount Sinai. In some cases, I should say, it's difficult to see exactly what was Justinian's and what came from other emperors. Really, in his propaganda, he even claims credit for things that apparently had very little to do with him. One of this is the Church of San Vitale in Ravenna, which is built during Justinian's time. A very elaborate mosaics. Unlike much of the building, the early Byzantine building, which would be destroyed later on, as we'll discuss during Iconoclasm, this is in Italy and still remains to this day, and therefore features one of the most famous mosaics with Justinian right here in the center. You can see him in his hands. This is a paten. This is an extremely large paten that was used, of course, to hold the bread at Mass, and potentially showing that emperors had to give gifts when they went to the Mass. It also shows on Justinian's side, on the right, the clergy, which was thought again to be a sort of a part of state that had to serve him. On the far left, the army, which also served him, and to his immediate left, civil servants, who, as you can see, are actually at this point are really dressed very close to how the clergy are dressed, and eventually, really the clergy will continue wearing this sort of old Roman dress, whereas, of course, the bureaucrats end up being phased out eventually. The other side of this church, facing that mosaic, this is a mosaic with Theodora in the center, showing just the enormous finery. She has a chalice there, but she has male servants and all sorts of ladies in waiting upon her as well. One of the things that really begins to impact Justinian's reign in a very negative way is an outbreak of the plague in approximately the year 541. This is an image of the bacterium Yersinia pestis. This appears to have been a version of the same exact plague that would later strike Europe in the Great Black Death. But in fact, it already was striking Europe at this point. And really, it appears, especially through merchant ships, it spreads to all sorts of ports throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and we do tend to think that the mortality was enormous, although very difficult to measure. We know that in Constantinople there was a particularly awful outbreak of this disease, and as part of this, too, of all the death, there was a breakdown in the food supply. So even those people who had survived the disease didn't necessarily have food to eat. We do think in a relatively short period of time, well over half the population of Constantinople would die. Generally speaking, the kind of hits that the Byzantines would take throughout the empire as a result of this disease raging through ends up dropping the tax base, and meaning that there are far fewer people who are capable of military service. We also see, too, that probably the attack of the plague has an effect on the war. We see that Belisarius, after having attacked on the Eastern Front, there really is, it's indecisive between him and the Persians, because both sides end up contracting the disease. So in effect, battles basically cease on that front. For a certain period of time, Justinian himself will actually come down with the disease, talk begins to circulate about potentially Belisarius taking over upon Justinian's death, which must have driven Justinian mad, for really makes Justinian decide to strip Belisarius of command for a certain period. It's possible, because Belisarius is no longer involved in it, that the war in Italy becomes much more lackluster than it had been previously. The Byzantine generals who were sent over to Italy appears they were attempting to mop up the kind of fighting against the Ostrogoths, but they were often divided. They squabbled among themselves. They suffer foolish casualties, and at times they simply do not pay their own troops. This is for this reason some of these troops decide to riot. This situation had gotten so bad that Belisarius is given command again. He goes, manages to unify forces again, helps to create the best situation he could hope for, which was a stalemate. Altogether, we do think that this Italian war, which had started off with such optimism, ended up just sucking a lot of time, men, and resources. And really, the Ostrogoths had proved to be far hardier in battle than anyone had anticipated. But part of the problem here was that the Byzantines simply had never sent enough troops to be able to properly finish the job. Finally, after long fighting, Justinian decided to invade Italy in overwhelming force. We also see, in effect, that as part of this attack, he also has to work against the Ostrogothic navy, which actually at a point had decided to attack Sicily. Even after this large army manages to string together some successes against the Ostrogoths, yet more barbarians take advantage in a lull and attack northern Italy itself. So it's very clear that the threat of barbarians attacking Italy had not completely dissipated, even after finally having sent more troops. We think that when all the dust had cleared, ultimately speaking, the Byzantines had retaken Italy, but the land that they had taken was so ravaged by fighting. Agriculture in some places was completely destroyed, and what's more, people had also suffered mortality during the plague. So it appears, to some degree, to have been a Pyrrhic victory. Even before Italy had been properly retaken, Justinian unbelievably would also make an expedition to Spain. This idea would have appeared absolutely insane to any other emperor, that Spain was so far removed from the center of power of the Roman world now. The reason Justinian decided to act when he did is that there were succession problems with the Visigothic kings. The Visigoths, the so-called Western Goths, being the group that held Spain at the time. We also see, too, what particularly appeared to inflame Justinian was that the Visigoths were heretics, and he didn't feel they should hold Spain. The Byzantines do attack Spain during this period. Here's the crown of one of the Visigothic kings. They establish a small reconquered territory there, but really it could not be held for very long. It was quickly reconquered by the Visigoths, and really, in effect, even Justinian begins to recognize perhaps that he's overextending himself. And so no more men or money was sent to Spain again. On the whole, we do think that Justinian has one of these sort of the epical reigns. I've just, of course, been listing many of the things that are viewed as the greatest failures of his time in power. It is not fair to say that the entire thing was a disaster, however. Really, even taking the areas like Spain that had been reconquered quickly, they really had reconquered a good deal of land. And a place like Sicily, for instance, is so rich that even in of itself, that case, the conquest paid for itself. And the same could be said of Africa. We also think, ultimately speaking, that they had gotten a lot of precious metals like gold after having fought both the Ostrogoths and the Vandals. It is also fair to say that Justinian, neither anyone else, could really have anticipated the plague would take so many lives. And so, ultimately speaking, some people think that if his reconquest had just stopped a little bit earlier, taken some monarch successes in Italy, avoided Spain, then really, in some sense, very quickly would have paid for itself. Of course, it's always easy to be Monday morning quarterback about these things. All right. Thank you.